So all of us have different backgrounds. All of us come from different places in terms of our stories and what we experienced growing up. All of us are in different places when it comes to our faith and what we believe about that. However, there's still a lot we all have in common. And one of the things that all of us have in common is none of us plan to mess up our lives. Nobody plans to, make decisions and choices and go down roads and paths that cause you to end up with regret, that cause you to end up having seasons that you might not call it regret, but you'd say, boy, if I could relive that moment, I would do it differently. If I could rewind and undo that moment, I would rewind and undo that moment. None of us want to create, relational chaos in our lives that kind of follows us along. And, some of those decisions we have a tendency to make that can, carry on and on the consequences of them for a long time. None of us plan to do that. And yet, isn't it true? We see this happen all the time. We see it happen every day. We all know stories of people who have done this. Matter of fact, if we were really honest, we all have stories, don't we? That we could all tell of times or moments or seasons in our past when we created some of these, wish I could relive that, I'd do it differently, or, wish I could undo that regret kind of moment. Which leads us to this question that we're going to talk about for the next few weeks. Can you plan today to prevent regrets tomorrow? Is that even possible? Because we don't know what the future holds, and we don't know, this is what makes it challenging, right? You don't often know if you make this decision where that's going to lead and what the consequences are going to be. You don't often see how this is connected to this, which is connected to this. So is it even possible to plan today to prevent regrets tomorrow? Is it possible, even though you don't know the future and you can't predict all of that, is it possible to put some things in your life to avoid that decision that you end up regretting, that relationship that you wish you could undo, that conversation that leads to that thing that leads to that thing, which creates a problem? Is it possible to avoid that entire season of life? Is it possible to avoid that weekend or that, that moment or that stage of your life where you look back and go, oh, what was I thinking? I wish I could, undo that. Is it possible to avoid that financial commitment you thought was a smart move or you didn't really pay much attention to? You didn't even think it was a big deal, and then later on it turned out to be a big deal. Is it possible to avoid all of that stuff when you can't predict the future and you don't know for sure exactly what's coming? I mean, this is what makes it challenging, right? This is the trouble with defining moments. Oftentimes, defining moments don't look like defining moments when you make the decisions. They just look like ordinary moments, and yet looking back, you realize, oh, that really was a defining moment for me. So is there a way, in spite of all that we don't know, and in spite of all that we sometimes ignore, is there a way to plan today to prevent regrets tomorrow? I am convinced the answer to this question is yes, without a doubt. And so what I want to do over the next few weeks is I want to dig into how we can plan today to prevent regrets tomorrow. Regrets we don't even see coming, regrets in some cases we don't even know we would have. So about 7 years ago, just to give you some context, 7 years ago, I did this guardrail series, and we talked about some principles around this series. Very few of you were around then, so for many of you this is going to be new information, but for those of you who are around, I want to approach this in a new and a fresh way anyway. And I want us to talk for a few weeks about some principles that I feel so fortunate because I was taught these, most of them when I was a teenager, some of them in my 20s. I was so fortunate to have some people around me. I don't think this is normal, but I had some people around me who took the time to sit down with me and to teach me and to model for me some of the principles that I'm going to share with you. And without a doubt, I am convinced my life is remarkably better because of those principles that they taught that I applied to my life that we're going to talk about for the next few weeks. My life, as far as I'm concerned, I am convinced, you'll never convince me otherwise, that I have a lot less of those regret stories. I have a lot less of those, oh, if I could go back and redo or relive that part of my life, I'd do it differently. I have far less of those stories because of these principles. And so I thought, you know what, let's cycle back here and let's talk about these because I want the same thing for you that I was privileged and fortunate enough to have some people explain to me. So over the next few weeks, we're going to get very specific, and we're going to talk about what this looks like. Today, I just want to start by introducing the topic of why the idea of guardrails matters so much. So just to get us all on the same page, you know what guardrails are like when you're driving. You know what it looks like to see guardrails on the road, but let me just give us an official definition, okay? A guardrail is a system designed to keep vehicles from straying into dangerous or off-limits areas. You can picture guardrails in your head, can't you? Now, here's what none of us think about until we need one. But guardrails on the road, it's a system. In other words, somebody pre-planned, somebody sat down and in advance intentionally thought through and decided, you know what? there are going to be some people who are driving on this road. There are going to be some people who are going around this curve, who are driving by this cliff, who are on this bridge, who are on this interstate. There are going to be some people who end up veering off of the road into the danger zone, and we better put a guardrail there. We better put something there to minimize the damage and to keep them from going off the cliff, to keep them from hitting oncoming traffic, to keep them from veering into something that's deadly. Somebody actually sat down and looked at where those roads were and said, we better put some guardrails in these places because there is some danger on the other side of the road. Now, you and I never think about that until we hit one. Some of you have hit a guardrail before, and after you hit the guardrail and you looked at what was on the other side of the guardrail, in spite of the damage that guardrail caused to your car, you were really grateful for that guardrail, weren't you? You were so grateful because you saw what it could have been like if the guardrail wouldn't have been there. You were so grateful somebody stopped in advance and thought about you and your reckless driving and realized we better put a guardrail there for them. Some of you have hit multiple guardrails. It's why I don't ride with you anywhere. But you're really appreciative, aren't you? Like, you get it. You understand, okay? It is, again, we never think about this until we need one. We never think about it until we hit one. But then it's like, oh my goodness, I'm so glad that system was there. I'm so glad somebody thought ahead to keep me from getting myself into a lot of deadly, dangerous trouble. It is a system designed to keep our vehicles from straying into dangerous or off-limits areas. Now, every guardrail, the system, when people designed the system of guardrails, it had a very specific purpose. Guardrails have two purposes, to be exact. Guardrails are designed to direct and to protect. This is what they do. They direct us where we ought to go, and they protect us from where we shouldn't. They direct us, down the right road, and they protect us from danger on either side. This is the way it works with guardrails. They direct and they protect. Now, here's the thing about guardrails, and again, we don't really think of this until we have to use one, but here's the thing about guardrails as well. Guardrails are always placed in the safety zone. They're never placed in the danger zone. In other words, just pay attention in the future when you're driving. They always place a guardrail on a piece of real estate you could actually drive on and be okay. Think about that. It's always in a safe place. A guardrail is never placed in a place that once you hit it, you're already in danger. It's always in a safe place to keep you from the danger. They're always in safety zone, never in the danger zone. However, none of us have ever organized a march and a protest because they're taking away a little piece of our road that we could drive on if that guardrail wasn't there. None of us care. We're glad it's there because we understand by being there, even though it's taking away a little bit of our road or real estate, it's protecting us from something way worse. So we have no problem with them putting a guardrail in the safety zone. That we just understand they're there to direct us, they're there to protect us. Now, here's my point, and here's my suggestion, and here's my premise for the next few weeks. Not only do we need guardrails on the road for some of us drivers, we need guardrails in our lives too. And while some of us may be worse drivers than others and utilize guardrails more than others, the reality is when it comes to life, we all need some. We all need some emotional guardrails. We all need some financial guardrails. We need some moral guardrails. We need some marital guardrails, some relational guardrails, some friendship guardrails. All of us, some of us need some professional guardrails. All of us, when it comes to the different arenas of our lives, we need some guardrails in place. I would suggest to you that your previous regrets, those seasons of your life or those moments in your life, if you could redo it, you would redo it. If you could live it over again, you'd do it differently. All of your regrets could have been avoided if you would have just had some guardrails in place in your life. And I would suggest to you that future regrets can be prevented if you would just put some guardrails in your life today. You say, well, I don't know what those regrets even are. You don't have to know. I don't know what the consequences would be of the decision. You don't have to know. Because if you'll put some guardrails in your life in the safety zone, far enough away from the danger zone, you'll never get in that danger to figure out what that danger actually is. You could use some guardrails for life too. So, when I talk about guardrails for life, for the purpose of the rest of this series, let me give you a definition for what I mean by this kind of guardrail, okay? A guardrail is a personal standard of behavior that becomes a matter of conscience. So, it's a personal standard. This is not, and we'll get into this more in just a minute, a guardrail, in terms of what I'm talking about, is not a sin or no sin situation. It's not black and white. It's not about right or wrong. A guardrail is a personal standard of behavior, which means the guardrails I have aren't necessarily the guardrails you should have. Everybody's guardrails need to look a little different, and I'll explain why as we go throughout the series. It is a personal standard of behavior. Not right or wrong. As we're going to see in a minute, it's about what's wise or unwise. It is a personal standard of behavior. For me, the wisest thing to do is this, and the wisest thing to do is never to do that. But it's a personal standard of behavior, and this is key, that becomes a matter of conscience. In other words, it becomes almost like right or wrong for you, even though you know it isn't. And every time you bump into that guardrail, it dings your conscience a little bit. Every time you hit that guardrail, it kind of lights up your conscience and causes you to pay attention. And you haven't gotten yourself in any danger. You haven't done anything wrong, but it causes you to go, whoa, 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 I didn't even realize it, and I'm starting to drift a little bit towards the ditch in this area of my life. I'm starting to drift a little bit towards the cliff in this area, and it allows you to correct and to get back on the right track without causing hardly any damage at all. So, for the next few weeks, we're going to talk specifics, because you're going, well, I don't know exactly what you mean. I get it, okay? We're going to talk very specific, practical guardrails you can put in your life, in different arenas of your life, over the next few weeks. Today, I'm not going to give you a lot of specifics, but I do want to help you understand why guardrails are so important. Because here's the thing, as we get into this and start talking about it, you are going to find yourself resisting this idea of guardrails. And I'll tell you the other thing you're going to find. If you decide to put some guardrails in your life, I know I've done this for 2 decades now. You put guardrails in your life, nobody around you is going to applaud you. Nobody around you is going to celebrate you. As a matter of fact, you will sometimes get criticized for the guardrails you put in your life. People will be confused. They will not understand why you don't do those things or why you do those things when there's nothing wrong necessarily with those things. And so you're not going to necessarily get a lot of encouragement from this, from other people. But they are a matter, in some cases, of life and of death in the different arenas in your life. So today I just want to dive into why they're so important and try to convince you to at least consider this topic and to track with us over the next few weeks. In about AD 62, the Apostle Paul, you heard of Paul, the Apostle Paul was writing a letter to a group of Christians in the city of Ephesus. Now, if you don't know much about Paul's backstory, it's fascinating. Paul was not a follower of Jesus until about 7 years, we think, after the resurrection happened. As a matter of fact, when people started saying, hey, we saw Jesus die and we saw him alive again, Paul decided this is not good for my religion, Judaism. This is not good for what's going on in Jerusalem, so I'm going to take it on myself to put an end to this movement. And he began to find these people and try to arrest them and shut them up, persecute them. In some cases, he had them killed. Paul was not necessarily a good guy. But he was very sincere in his beliefs, and he thought he was doing the right thing. So he does this for about 7 years, and until one day he has his own personal face-to-face conversation with a risen Jesus, and at that point he can't deny it anymore, and he does a complete 180 in a moment. And it goes from being the biggest church hater to being a guy who travels around the known world at the time and starts churches wherever he went. He's got a fascinating story. So he's writing to Christians in Ephesus because he's been there and he started a church there before. Now he's writing back to them. And if you read this letter we call Ephesians, if you read this letter, here's what you find. For most all of the letter, Paul addresses one behavior after another behavior with them, and he talks to them about, you should be careful about this, you shouldn't do this, you should watch this, you should, no follower of Jesus should engage in this. Like, he just talks about all these behaviors, and if you read it and you go, well, why in the world would he do that? Well, I'll tell you why. 3 guesses. They were engaging in all those behaviors, okay? They couldn't quite figure it out, and so they kept veering off the road. They kept drifting into the ditch. They kept wandering into the danger zone. And so Paul's talking to them about all of this, and then he gets near the end of his letter, and he explains to them, he does not use the term guardrail, but he explains to them the principle behind a guardrail and why it's so important that they put that guardrail, that principle in their life. And then he gives them, for their context and for their culture, he gives them an example of a guardrail. So I want to read you what he said about why guardrails are important, and then we're going to look at the example that he gives together. And then I'm going to give you a question to think about this week, and we'll get you out of here, okay? So here's what Paul says. He says, be very careful then how you live. So in other words, Paul's like, okay, listen, this isn't normal, and most people don't do this, but you have to be careful how you're living your life every day. You have to be careful about the decisions you're making. You have to be careful about what you engage in. You need to be thoughtful. You need to be deliberate. You need to be intentional about how you live every single day of your life. You cannot just, I'll take it as it comes, and life will come my way, and I'll figure it out. Paul says, no, that's not a smart way to live. You shouldn't just go with the flow. Paul says that's not a smart way to live. You go with the flow, you end up in the current of culture, which means you end up where everybody else is, living the life everybody else lives. And this is Paul's way of saying, you don't want that, do you? Like you look around, you don't want to be in the same financial position that most of the people around you are in. You don't want to be living paycheck to paycheck and in debt. And you don't want to live that way. You don't want to have the marriage that a lot of the people around you have, where it's just kind of like two people living in the same house and they don't get along. There's always tension and strife. You don't want that. You don't want the same relationship with your kids that so many people have. You don't want to end up professionally where so many people end up. Like, you don't want the life everybody else has. So don't just go with the flow, because you end up in the current of culture. You end up where everybody else ends up. He says, no. You need to be very, very careful how you live. And then he gives us some specifics. He says, not as the unwise, but as wise. Okay, now, let me define for you what he means by this, because when you read the text of Scripture, all the way back to Solomon, James in the New Testament, you name it, all these different guys, when they began to talk about wise and unwise, they all defined it pretty much the same way. A wise person is a person who understands that all of life is connected. In other words, a wise person realizes that one thing leads to another thing, which leads to another thing, which leads to another thing. That there's no such thing as an isolated decision. A wise person realizes, no. Like, when I make a decision, it moves me in a specific direction. When I make a decision, it leads to something else. So I have to be careful. I've got temptations that come naturally to me. I have some blind spots I don't even know that I have. I've got to make sure that I pay attention to those and I figure those out and I live my life aware of the fact that if I don't pay attention to the temptation, the blind spots, if I'm not careful about what I do here, it can lead me to something I don't want to experience. That's what a wise person does. An unwise person simply is the opposite. An unwise person, and sometimes in the text of Scripture they use the term foolish, an unwise person is someone who believes all of life is disconnected. So every decision is isolated. I can do what I want here. I'll make a decision here. It doesn't lead to anything. That's what an unwise person thinks. An unwise person thinks, I have blind spots and temptations, but I'll figure it out and it's not going to bother me. It's not going to hurt me any. I don't have to pay attention to that. An unwise person looks at the foolish choices of others and says, how foolish of them, but that would never happen to me. Yeah, but you're doing the same thing. I know, but I'm smarter than that. So I'm not going to end up where they ended up. This is how an unwise person thinks. So Paul says, you got to be very, very careful how you live. You should live not as unwise. You shouldn't live your life thinking, oh, what I do today doesn't impact tomorrow. You should live your life understanding everything I do today leads to something else tomorrow. And I should pay attention if it's leading me in the right direction. So he goes on and he gives us this advice. He says, you should make the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. This is what it means to be careful. It means you make the most of every opportunity. See, Paul understood that every decision you have in life, that every encounter and experience and exchange and conversation you have in life, they're all opportunities. They're all opportunities because they're going to move you in a specific direction. That every decision you make takes you in a direction. Every decision moves you in a direction that leads to a predictable destination. So he says you should make the most of every opportunity that comes your way every day, realizing it can either move you closer to where you want to be in life or it can take you further away. And he says you have to be this careful and you have to be this intentional about how you live your life because the days are evil. Now, this isn't like your, cranky old grandfather who's on the front porch going, oh, days today are just evil, it's awful. It's not what Paul's doing. Here's all he means by this. He's saying that if you just go with the flow in the current of culture, it's going to take you somewhere you don't want to end up. This is what he's saying. He's saying the days are evil in this sense. That if you just kind of go along with what everyone else is doing, you're going to end up at a place you never wanted to end up. You're going to end up experiencing consequences you never wanted to experience. You are not going to stay on the road. You're going to drift in the ditch. It is inevitable. And here's why. Because culture today, and by that I just mean the way that normal, everyday people think today, the majority of people today, do not celebrate or encourage guardrails. Culture will never celebrate or encourage guardrails in your life. Culture celebrates and encourages painted lines. Now, let me explain the difference. You know this, okay? You're on a road. There's a big difference, isn't there, when they're driving between the white line on the side of the road and the guardrail a few feet away from it. There's a big difference, isn't there? White line on the side of the road or a guardrail. They do two totally different things. You hit a guardrail. It's impossible for you to hit a guardrail and not know you hit a guardrail. I guess one or two of you could pull that off. But for the average person, if you hit a guardrail, you know you hit a guardrail, right? It's impossible for you to hit a guardrail and not know it. So when you hit a guardrail, what does it do? It always gets your attention. And it may create a little bit of damage, but it's nothing severe. It gets you back on the road, moving in the right direction. It directs and it protects. A painted line doesn't do that. You can cross the white line on the side of the road and never know you crossed the white line. You can drift and cross the white line right into danger, and you have no idea until the danger hits. They serve two very different functions. And all Paul's saying here is this. Culture, the world in which we live, it encourages painted lines. It does not encourage guardrails, which means you can get into trouble really quickly. What culture does is culture baits us to the edge and ledge of disaster and then mocks us when we cross it. Culture baits us to the edge and ledge of that painted line, and then the minute we step over and we end up in trouble, we get punished for it. This is the way it works in culture. Let me see if I can explain it in a way that makes sense. I'll give you a couple examples, okay? Let's talk about, because this one's so easy to see, let's talk about alcohol for a minute. Okay, here's the message of our culture when it comes to alcohol. You've heard this. Drink responsibly. Now, this is great advice. It is. It's great advice. Okay? Here's the problem with this. This is not a guardrail. This is a painted line. Think of it this way. When an individual is drinking, do they realize the moment that they cross the line from responsible drinking to irresponsible drinking? No. They have no idea, do they? I mean, that's kind of the whole deal. Like, I don't know I'm irresponsibly drinking until I'm so far past the line that it's really obvious to everybody, including me, I'm irresponsibly drinking. It's a painted line. I'm not saying this is bad advice. It's not bad advice. It's just not helpful advice. Painted lines aren't really that helpful. It's not a guardrail. It doesn't get my attention and I realize, oh, I'm about to get irresponsible here and I'm about to, end up in danger. I better stop and redirect. That's not what this does. You actually have no idea when you cross the line from responsible to irresponsible. You just cross it. Suddenly you're irresponsible. You didn't even know. You ended up over there. But what happens in our culture when you cross that line from responsible to irresponsible? Culture, baits us to the edge of it. Be responsible, but enjoy. Be responsible, be responsible, be responsible. And then the minute we cross the line and we send a text that's inappropriate, there are consequences. The minute we cross the line and we make some comments that we wouldn't have normally made and it, tears a rift in a relationship, there are consequences. The minute you cross the line and then you get in a car and you cross the line in a car, suddenly there's a punishment. There's consequences to all that. Like, culture's not going to applaud you. Culture's going to punish you. Culture's going to mock you when you misuse this, when you cross the line. But there's no way, we would all say, yeah, you should drink responsibly. The problem is there's just no way to know when you cross the line from responsible to irresponsible. It's not actually that helpful. Here's another example. Specifically, this message is sent to teenagers and young adults in their 20s, but it applies to everybody. When it comes to the issue of sex, here's a message that our culture sends. Wait until you're ready. Wait until you're ready. Now, again, I'm not saying that's bad advice, but here's my deal on this. Every time I hear somebody say this, I think to myself, a woman came up with this advice. Now, I don't mean that bad, ladies. I'm not being critical. Y'all are way smarter than us men. But I know a woman came up with this because if you look at any red-blooded American 16-year-old male and say, are you ready? They'll say, I was born ready. I was born ready. Like, this is not helpful to any guy. Wait until you're ready. Oh, okay, well, I think we're good to go. It's like not helpful at all. I mean, you know this, right? It's not helpful. You ladies are smarter than us. You can process things. We don't process anything. It's just, here we go. So put on some JT. We're ready. It's like, nope. This is not helpful at all. At all. Okay, again, it's like a painted line. It's like a painted line. You can cross this. But again, here's the thing. You know this in our culture. Everything in our culture baits us to the edge and ledge of disaster sexually. Everything does. But the second you step across the line and you make some sexual advances that were inappropriate, the second you step across the line and you misunderstand, the second you step across the line and you misuse this in some way, the second you step across the line and you've got an unwanted pregnancy or you've got a, out of marriage pregnancy, there are people in our culture, all of a sudden there are consequences to all that. And you get baited to the edge and the ledge, but then you get mocked the second you cross over it. So I'm not dissing any of this advice. I'm just telling you, painted lines aren't that helpful, are they? You can cross a painted line, you have no clue you've crossed it until you're already in a lot of danger with a lot of consequences. So Paul says you should be really careful how you live. You should be wise. You should make the most of every opportunity. You should figure out how to live with some guardrails in your life, because the days are evil, which was just his way of saying if you don't have guardrails, you will get, sucked off into trouble. You will end up drifting. Everything about the current culture is going to push you that direction. You're going to cross some lines you don't even know you've crossed until it's too late. So he sums up this idea of why guardrails are important with this statement. He says this: therefore, do not be foolish. Don't be unwise, but understand what the Lord's will is. So he says, listen, don't live your life moving forward like this behavior I'm engaged in and this decision I make and this thing that I decide to do and, this move that I'm going to make. Don't live your life as if none of those things are connected and they're not going to lead to something else in your future. Everything leads to something which leads to something. So he says, don't be foolish. Instead, understand what the Lord's will is. Now, we'll talk more about what he means by this in just a second. But in essence, what he's saying is this. You got two options. You can just trust, I'll figure it out. It's not going to happen to me. I can control this. I'll never go too far. I'll never cross that line. You can trust yourself. Paul's saying that's not very smart. Instead, you should say, I'm not going to trust me. I'm going to trust the one who designed me to be. I'm not going to trust me. I'm going to trust the one who designed me to be, who designed me to live this life, who has a purpose and a plan for me. I'm going to figure out and understand what that is. And that's the road I'm going to get on, and then I'm going to put some guardrails on each side of that road that when I start to drift, because we all drift, when I start to drift, it's going to light up my conscience. It's going to get my attention, and I can redirect myself back on the road. So Paul explains this principle to them, and then, this is so fascinating, he gives them an example straight out of their world. And I want to read it to you, and I'll try to give you the context of it. This has been misunderstood in churches, in our day and time quite a bit, but let me see if I can help you understand this guardrail he explains in the context of what they experienced, okay? Here is the example of a guardrail Paul gives them. He says, so, do not get drunk on wine. Let's talk about this because you need a guardrail for this. He says, do not get drunk on wine. Now, when he talks about drunkenness and their propensity to be drunk, it is a totally different context than what we experience today. In their world, they had, you can imagine, they had containers that were less than safe to store water in. And they would put water in these containers, and if that water sat there for too long, there'd be so much bacteria for them, it would make them sick, and oftentimes it would kill them. The water would kill them. They would have unsafe drinking water. And so what they often did to combat this, they didn't understand all the science behind it, but what they knew was this. If they had some wine mixed with their water, in other words, if they had wined water, so to speak, it would combat some of that. So there was a trade-off because there was a danger both ways. They knew if I drink this water, I may end up dead, but if I drink this wine, I may end up drunk. So they decided drunk sounds better than dead. I'm going to go with that one, and that's the way they operated, all right? So this was a really plausible situation for them because in the course of drinking and staying hydrated, if they weren't careful, if they didn't pay attention to what they were doing, they could get themselves drunk just trying to keep themselves hydrated. So, real quickly before we go on, this is not a message on alcohol at all, but since it comes up, Paul brings it up, I'll say this. If you have ever had one person have the courage to look at you and say you drink too much, you should probably pay attention to that. They might be right. If two people have had the courage to tell you drink too much, you drink too much. You should pay attention to that. Okay, it's real quiet in here. Let's move on. So, Paul says, don't get drunk on wine. Paul, why is it such a big deal? He says, here's why. Which leads to, this is his point. This is why a guardrail is so important, right? Paul's saying you got to understand that having a little too much wine and ended up drunk, that's not the end of the story. It leads to something. That's why you need a guardrail. One thing leads to another thing, which leads to trouble. Now, let's just play a game, and you can do this in your head. Please do not do this out loud. It could get awkward. But in your mind, I want you to finish Paul's statement, okay? What would you fill in the blank with right here? Don't get drunk with wine, which leads to what? Does anything come to mind for you? Does anyone come to mind for you? Do you have a nervous laughter? You're sitting next to them right now. Seriously, I mean, do you know anybody who has a story with some drunken moments that they wish they could go back, rewind, and relive differently? Some of you, this is really personal, because some of you think of a mom or a dad that just couldn't stay sober. And so you know one thing leads to another thing. I don't have to convince you of this because you lived it. One thing led to another thing for them, and their life would have been completely different if they could have just stayed sober. Not just them, your life would have been completely different if they would have just stayed sober. You would have given anything for them to have had some guardrails that kept them from getting drunk. So you get this, right? You get this. So here's the word that Paul uses. This is so interesting to me. Paul says, do not get drunk with wine. Why, Paul? Because it leads to debauchery. Now, none of you can define this term, but you all know it when you see it. It's the way it works, isn't it? Here's a definition of debauchery. Debauchery is when you indulge yourself because of a lack of or loss of self-control. In other words, I'll lack self-control, or I did something that caused me to lose self-control, and because of that, I'm making choices to indulge myself, often, pretty much always, at the expense of other people. And this is Paul's point. Paul says, okay, once you hit debauchery, you're in deadly territory. Once you hit debauchery, there's some serious consequences you'll never unwind and undo. Drunkenness, that's a danger zone, and it leads somewhere. One thing leads to another thing. Drunkenness leads to debauchery, and now you've got some serious regret and repercussion on your hands. See, debauchery is when you get behind the wheel of a car and you make some choices you just shouldn't have made, and you wouldn't have made if you were in your right mind, if you had self-control. Debauchery happens when you have too much to drink and you end up punching a woman, or you send a text and make some comments that create such a relational rift you can never undo it. When you end up in an argument that's never forgotten. When your kids see you in a way that then the nature of that relationship never fully recovers. Debauchery is when a pastime becomes a pathway for you to some really painful, difficult destinations. That's what debauchery looks like. I mean, we all understand this. Paul's point is, listen, by the time you hit debauchery, you're in big trouble. By the time you hit debauchery, you didn't even realize you were headed there, but all of a sudden, that gets deadly. Debauchery is the stuff you just can't undo. So here's his point about a guardrail. This is why he's giving them this example. He says debauchery is deadly. Drunkenness is just a little bit back from debauchery. You know, because some of you are going, well, you can be drunk and not end up making those choices. Yeah, you can. But drunkenness is the danger zone. And you're teetering right on the edge and ledge of debauchery. So Paul says, if you're wise, if you're being careful about how you live your life, here's what you should do. You should step back, and you figure out how far back you need to be, because it's a personal standard of behavior. But you should step back far enough away from the danger zone, far enough away from drunkenness, that you have no temptation, that you have zero odds of ever accidentally ending up in drunkenness. And you should put a guardrail right there. And that guardrail, every time you hit it, it's going to light up your conscience, and it's going to cause you to realize, I'm starting to drift, and I'm getting close to the danger zone. I'm getting close to something that's going to lead to something that's going to lead to a lot of trouble. Well, I want to stop and redirect right now. That's how a guardrail works. Now, again, isn't it interesting? Paul doesn't tell us what that guardrail should be. Why? Because this isn't about sin or no sin. The guardrail isn't about, oh, if you do that, it's wrong. No, this isn't black and white, right or wrong. This is just you saying, what's the wise thing for me to do? How far away from danger should I stay so I'm never at risk of ending up in danger, which leads to worse things. So for some of you, when it comes to the alcohol thing, your guardrail may be 2 drinks. 2 drinks. I never have more than 2 drinks. For some of you, it may be I never have more than 1 drink. For some of you, it may be, given your past family history or your past personal struggles, your guardrail may be I don't drink. I don't drink. Again, it's not is it sin or not a sin. It's what is a wise thing for me to do? Where do I need to put this guardrail so it's far enough away I never end up in danger? This is the point Paul's making, because again, guardrails protect us from something. You got to put your guardrail far enough away in the safety zone that's going to protect you from the danger. Now, the flip side of it is this. Remember, I told you guardrails have 2 purposes. They protect us from where we shouldn't go, but they also direct us where we should. So Paul is about to flip the coin, if you will. He's about to talk to us for just a second about where a guardrail should direct us. Now, this is where he dives into his faith. And if you're not a person of faith, you're not sure what you believe about Jesus, everything I've said up to this point is common sense. You probably agree with it to some extent. This is where we dive into the faith piece a little bit, but I think this is so interesting. Even if you don't agree, I think you'll find this fascinating and something worth considering. Because here's what Paul believed. Paul believed that God doesn't just keep us from things. He actually wants a relationship with us because he wants things for us. It's not just what can I get from them, it's more what can I have for them. So Paul says, okay, God's trying to use guardrails to protect you from something, but he's also trying to direct you somewhere. And here's where he's trying to direct us. Paul says, instead of being drunk on wine, be filled with the Spirit. Be filled with the Spirit. Now, this sounds really religious, so let me explain to you what he means by this. So Paul believed, and he taught and wrote about in all of these documents he wrote about the fact that when a person chooses to be a follower of Jesus, which just means this, when a person chooses to acknowledge, I cannot atone for my own sin, for my own mistakes, I can't make up what I messed up. I need Jesus to forgive me. I need to trust what he did on the cross paid the penalty for all my sins. The minute a person acknowledges that and chooses to trust Jesus to forgive them and make them a part of God's family, Paul teaches that God takes his Spirit and places his Spirit not with, but actually in the life of the person who's chosen to trust him. And that God, through his Spirit, is always there to do two things for us, to direct us and to protect us. We get the protect part sometimes because if you're a follower of Jesus, there have been moments you were about to make a decision. It seemed like it would be fine to make, but you just had this tension inside. It was like the Holy Spirit was just tapping on your conscience going, no, don't do that. Pay attention, pay attention. And sometimes we listen, sometimes we ignore it, and then later on we realize, oh yeah, that's why I should have paid attention. So we understand the Spirit sometimes protects us from ending up in places we shouldn't end up. But Paul also taught the Spirit is there to direct us in the right way to go. This is what he means when he says you should be filled with the Spirit. In another letter he wrote to the Christians in the city of Galatia, he actually defines for us what it means to be filled in the Spirit. Here's what he said. To be filled with the Spirit means to be full of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. So this is all Paul's saying. He's saying you need a guardrail in your life because you need that guardrail to keep you from drifting into the ditch, from running off the cliff, from ending up in a dangerous and deadly situation. But you also need a guardrail in your life because you want to stay on the road that God has for you. You want to pursue the purpose and the plan for which he created you. And you are just like me. We all have a tendency to drift away from that. And Paul says if you don't have guardrails, you'll drift so far away from that, you'll end up in all kinds of trouble. But you put a guardrail in place in your life, and it protects you, but it also directs you. Now, think about it this way. Every time, if you have a guardrail in your life, every time you hit a guardrail, and you say, nope, I'm going to course correct and redirect, every time you do that, you are not only stepping away from danger, but you are stepping towards something else. And Paul says, this is what you're stepping towards. You're stepping towards a life where you have more gentleness, more patience, more love, more kindness, more self-control. And you don't need any limits for this, do you? You don't need any guardrails to keep you from getting too patient. Oh, I just got too patient. I need to reel that in. No. Nobody says that. You don't need a guardrail to keep you from being too loving, too joyful, too self-controlled. Way too much self-control there. I got to lose it a little more next time. Nobody says that. No, you don't need guardrails to protect you from this. This has no limits. You can't get too much of this. But Paul says, if you understand, this was his terminology in that verse before, if you understand the Lord's will, if you understand the plan and purpose God has for you, this is what he's taking you towards. And you show up in your family, and your family dynamics are marked by more of this, not less. And your work environment and relationships are marked by more of this, not less. And your dating and your marriage exhibits and demonstrates more of this, not less. When you let God direct you in the right way to go, you end up with the life you were created to live and the life you've always wanted to live. Because this takes life to a different level. So he says you need guardrails to direct and protect. Both. Now see, here's what's interesting about this. And I just want to make sure I'll make this clear. If you do this, if you put guardrails in your life, which protect you from danger and help you stay on the road to experiencing more and more of this. You will live a better life. You will get better at life. But the ultimate point of guardrails is not to live a better life. That's actually a byproduct. The ultimate point of putting guardrails in your life, what I want for you, the reason we're talking about this for a few weeks, is I want you to live a surrendered life. Very different from a better life. A surrendered life is a life that says, I don't think I know what's best for me, actually. I think God created and designed me for a plan and a purpose, and He knows better than I do how I should live and manage my life. That is a surrendered life. And that is a life that's very difficult for most of us to live. But when you reach the point where you trust that the direction He takes you is going to be this direction, the direction He takes you is going to pay off because you're going to have a lot more of this. When you surrender to doing what He asks you to do, even if it doesn't make sense to you in the moment, just because you trust Him, that's the moment you have a surrendered life. And a better life is always a result of that. But you're going to put some guardrails in your life, not just because you're trying to avoid danger, but because you want to stay on the road. And if you start to drift away from this, you want to know it quick. And you want to get back on the plan and the purpose that He has for you. So that is what Paul says is the entire point and purpose of guardrails. And it's why you need some in your life, and it's why I need some in mine. So here's what I want to do today. Next week, we're going to get into specifics. You're going, I don't really get it. What does it look like? Come back next week, okay? We'll get in specifics we'll talk about different areas of life over the next few weeks, and I'll give you some ideas of different guardrails you could put in place. But today, I just want to leave you with a question. And it is such a powerful question. My goal and my hope is this, that you won't ignore this, that you won't hear it, because I know I'll sit in seats and listen to guys like me too. You can hear it and go, oh yeah, well that's interesting, and just kind of go on about your day. No, I hope you write this down. You stick it in your phone, you snap a picture of it, whatever you need to do, and you will come back to this question this week, and you'll wrestle with it over and over again and think about it. And you don't have to do anything. You don't have to change anything because of this question. I'm not asking you to change anything. But you owe it to yourself to be honest with yourself about this question. Here it is. In light of my past experiences, my present circumstances, and my future dreams, what's the wise thing for me to do? Okay, so financially, I'm making these decisions, and it's all life's connected, so it's got to be leading to something. Well, in light of my past experiences, is that a really wise decision to make financially? Like, there's nothing wrong with it. Everybody else does it. Nobody else would see anything wrong with it. But for me, in light of my past financial choices, in light of the decisions I've made and the debt that I had and, the paycheck to paycheck deal I've been through, in light of all of that and, what I've gone through in my past, what's the wisest thing for me to do here financially? In light of the present circumstances in my dating relationship or in my marriage and what we got going on and the tension or the issues or the challenges, in light of my present circumstances, what's the wise thing? Like, there'd be nothing wrong with other people doing that, but is that really the wisest thing for me to do given everything that's going on in my life right now? Hey, in light of the future dreams and hopes that I have, is that really the wisest thing to do for my family? Is that really the wisest thing to do for my kids? Is that really the wisest thing to do for my career, my academics? I mean, in light of what I hope to experience one day, in light of what I dream will be true about my life one day, there's nothing wrong with doing it, but will it actually lead to the thing that leads to the thing that leads to my dream? Is it really wise for me to do that? In light of my past experience, my present circumstances, and my future dreams, what is the wise thing? Not right or not right, not sinful or not sinful. It's not about that. What is the wise thing for me? I don't know what the wise thing is for you, but what is the wise thing for me to do? And let me tell you why this question is so important for you to think about. Because as we talk about guardrails, if it hasn't already, when we get into specifics, you will naturally resist the idea of putting guardrails in your life. You will. I'm just like you. I do too. You'll resist it because you'll say, I don't need that. I'm smarter than those people. That's never going to happen to me. I don't want anything taking away my freedom. You'll resist it because you'll want to argue, but there's nothing wrong with that. But there's nothing wrong with that. But there's nothing wrong with that. To which I'll say, no, there's nothing wrong with that. But it's not about right or wrong. It's about wise or unwise. I'm telling you, we all tend to resist this. This question cuts through all the resistance. This question kind of pulls you back out of all the emotion, because emotions cloud judgment. It pulls you away from all the emotion and causes you to go, oh yeah, that's not really wise. That's not wise, because that doesn't even lead to the thing that leads to the thing that leads me where I want to go. So why would I do that? Why would I ignore that? Why would I choose that? No, I want to do what's wise for me. I'm telling you, nobody plans to wreck their life. Nobody plans to wreck their marriage, their finances, their family, their relationship with their kids, their relationship with their parents. Nobody plans to wreck their career. Nobody plans to wreck the academic dreams and hopes and opportunities they have. Nobody plans to wreck their life. The problem is, nobody plans not to. We just assume it's not going to happen to us. But it can, and it often does, if you don't plan. And guardrails are how you intentionally plan not to wreck your life. It's how you intentionally plan to avoid and prevent regrets tomorrow. So let me ask you something, and we'll wrap up. As I've been talking today, where have you felt the tension? I bet for a lot of us, something's come to mind. Someone's come to mind. Some situations come to mind where we immediately thought, I'm not really being wise right there. And you're just like me. We start justifying our behavior and rationalizing it away and trying to ignore it. But you owe it to yourself to pay attention to that tension. Where have you felt that? Where are you flirting with danger? Where are you on the edge and the ledge of trouble? Where are you already in the danger zone? And it hasn't fully led to the point that it's irreversible, the consequences, but you're getting close. Will you be honest enough with yourself to acknowledge that and to ask yourself about that situation? Wait a minute, what's the wise thing to do here? Will you be humble enough to surrender to the God who loves you and has a purpose for you, and trust Him enough to put some guardrails in place to keep you on the path and on the road that He has for you? Your future is one you're going to write by the decisions and the choices you make today. Choose wisely. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for this wisdom written 2,000 years ago, and here we are, we're still talking about it. This is so hard to apply, though, so would you give us the courage to face the tensions we feel, give us the courage to address those situations and circumstances and relationships and conversations that we know, oh man, we're just flirting right on the edge and ledge of disaster. And then give us the boldness to act on them. Give us the wisdom to change. Help us to be honest enough with ourselves to admit where we are and to invite you in to guide us back where we need to be. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.